want to start by presenting two examples. The first one is application to molecular dynamics. So consider a molecule oscillating stochastically in water. For example, the alanine dipeptide molecule that consists of 10 atoms. Now, due to the coherent structure of the molecule, we can describe the motion of the molecule or the trajectories of all the atoms just by very few parameters. For example, in this alanine dipeptide example, those few parameters are going to be the dihedral angles marked here by phi and psi. Now, let's say we don't have access to the entire molecule. For example, think of a scenario where we observe only 3 atoms of the molecule for a certain period of time, then another 3 for another period of time, and the rest for the last period of time. And our task is to describe all the motion of all the atoms of that molecule. So our approach here would be to first derive intrinsic variables, something that is going to correspond to the dihedral angles of the molecule, and then try to learn the model between those intrinsic variables and the atoms in order to reconstruct the entire molecule. Now, the idea is that no matter which atoms we observe, we always want to derive the same intrinsic underlying variables. The second example is from a completely different field. Here, we want to predict epileptic seizures based on EEG recording. So what we have here is 1 hour recording of an EEG signal. As you can see, the epileptic seizure is pretty distinct. But in order to predict the seizure, what we actually need is to see some difference between the part that comes right before the seizure and the part that, let's say, is far away. Now, at least by observation on the raw signal, or even on the spectrum, you can see that this is quite hard to see any distinguish between this part and this part. So the approach that we want to take is similar to what we want to do with the molecular dynamics. We are going to assume that the EEG measurements are actually controlled by just few underlying processes that represent, let's say, the brain activity. And our hope is that if we find such processes that represent brain activity, the job of predicting will be easier. Now, the challenge in this example is that unlike the molecular dynamic example, here we don't have ground truth. We don't know what are these processes that represent the brain activity, so we need to infer them completely in an empirical way. So the search for underlying processes or underlying representation led us to manifold learning. The idea in manifold learning is to represent the measurements in a high-dimensional space, then assume that those points in high-dimensional space don't fill uniformly the entire space, but rather lie on a low-dimensional structure that is called a manifold, and that structure is governed by the underlying processes. For example, the points can be the atom trajectories, and the governing processes are the dihedral angle and dihedral angles in the molecule itself. So we want to use the manifold learning approach, and in the end, what we are going to get is a parameterization of the manifold. In this work that I'm going to present, we are using 2 manifold learning techniques. The first one is Laplacian Eigen maps proposed by Belkin and Yoel, and the second one is diffusion maps proposed by Coifman. Now, let me now get into some more details and formulate the problem. Here we are using the state space approach. The first part is the dynamical model. Theta T denotes the low-dimensional processes or the state of the dynamical model. And it propagates in time according to this stochastic differential equation where we have unknown drift and driving white noise. The second part is the measurement modality, is the way that we measure or see those underlying processes. So we denote that by Zt and assume that it is an unknown function G of 2 components. The first component, Y, let's call it the interesting part of the measurement. This is, or the clean observation component, that is drawn from a time-varying PDF that depends on or controlled by the underlying The second component, V, is just a corrupting measurement noise and ambient noise that is independent of the interesting part. And what we want to do is track, reveal and track the underlying process that is given measurements without any model sample, not model assumptions, but model knowledge. So the job here is to do it completely in an empirical way. Now, as I mentioned before, we want to use manifold learning. The main component of manifold learning is building a kernel, which is actually an affinity matrix between pairs of measurements. And the most common kernel is a Gaussian that relies on Euclidean distance between the pair of measurements. The second usual step is to normalize the kernel and obtain a Laplacian operator, and then applying eigenvalue decomposition or spectral decomposition on the kernel, we get the eigenvectors, which are used as a representation of the underlying factors. So to summarize the outline of the algorithm, we start with the underlying processes. Then we measure them somehow and obtain our measurements. Then we want to apply manifold learning, so we need to compute the kernel based on pairs of measurements, and in the end, we get a parameterization in the form of eigenvectors, which are hopefully a good representation of what we started with, of the underlying processes. Now, the problem is this. The main idea of manifold learning is to capture the geometry of the data set that we have at hand. But according to our problem formulation, the mapping between the measurements and the underlying processes can be stochastic. It means that if we observe a phenomenon, and if we measure that phenomenon several times, we'll get several sets of measurements with different geometry. Or if we measure the same phenomenon using two different instruments, again, we'll get different sets of measurements with different geometry. So what I want to emphasize is what we really want is intrinsic modeling, an intrinsic characterization of the geometry. So no matter how we measure things, we can measure things in two different ways and get two different geometrical structures. Or even we can have partial observations. Like in the molecule example, we always want to infer the same intrinsic representation that actually describes the same phenomena that we observe. So that's the goal, and the question is how to obtain such an intrinsic model. Now, since we use manifold learning that relies on the kernel, the question that we ask ourselves is whether this common kernel, this Gaussian, represents the information that we want. And our answer was no. So what we are proposing is first to find a better description of the measurements, and then to find an intrinsic measure between the measurements that is going to replace the Euclidean distance. So let me try to explain the idea. If we go back to the model, to the formulation of the problem, if we observe samples of the underlying process, then, if we observe samples of the underlying process in a short window in time, we can assume that the drift is approximately fixed. And all we see is the random noise, which means that geometrically, what we get is just a round cloud of points. Now, this round cloud of points is translated to elliptic clouds in the measurement domains. Now, those elliptic clouds, or better say, the principal directions of those elliptic clouds, respect the shape of the measurement manifold. So the idea here is to exploit those natural perturbations that we have in the underlying process in order to explore and learn the tangent planes of the manifold. And then we'll search for a metric that, instead of comparing the two points on the manifold, it compares the 2 points with respect to the principal directions of the tangent planes. So in practice, this is going to look familiar, I think. What we propose is to use histograms as descriptors of the measurements. And then we capture those small perturbations using an estimate of the local covariance matrix of the descriptors of the histograms. Now, using the histograms and the local covariance matrices, we define a metric. The metric is called Mahalanobis distance, and this is a metric between a pair of measurements, and it equals to the distance between the histograms, between the descriptors, normalized by the sum of the inverses of the local covariance matrices. Now, I will just go over quickly on some of the results to explain why we chose that. I see something moved here. Anyway, first we assume that the histograms are linear transformation of the PDF of the measurements. It basically means that we can write each histogram bin as an integration over the PDF of the measurement. Then our observation is that in the histogram domain, in our descriptors domain, any stationary noise is a linear transformation. Why? Because we can write the PDF of the measurement as an integral over the PDF of what we call the interesting part, and the PDF of the noise is just a fixed component in that linear transformation. Now, in general, it can be shown that the Mahalanobis distance is invariant under local linear transformations. It means that the Mahalanobis distance between the histograms is noise resilient, because we claim that any measurement noise is just a linear transformation. Moreover, we can show that the Mahalanobis distance between the histograms approximates the Euclidean distance between the corresponding samples of the underlying process to the second order. In order to prove that, we need to assume that our measurement function is bidirectional, which means that basically we have good measurements. On one hand, stable with respect to the underlying process, but on the other hand, sensitive. So we can still see those small perturbations of the underlying process and use that in order to explore and learn the manifolds of the tangent plane of the manifold. Under this assumption, the way to prove this is to use local linearization of the measurement function. So I'm not getting into details. I just want to mention the relationship that we have to information geometry, because at the beginning, when we first used manifold learning, we asked ourselves, does the structure of the measurements convey the information? And our answer was no, that the local densities of the measurements convey the information and not particular realizations. And that is the idea behind information geometry. In information geometry, you usually use the KL divergence, which is approximated by the Fisher matrix, as we saw earlier, to compute a metric between two densities, or two parametric densities. In our case, if we change the game a little bit, if instead of looking at the histograms, we look at the log of the histograms, then we can show that the Fisher information matrix that is used here to define the Fisher metric is actually J transpose J, where J is the Jacobian of the measurement function. On the other hand, the local covariance matrix is JJ transpose, is the dual multiplication of the Jacobian of the measurement function. So, in fact, there is a lot to say here, but in fact, let's say that it is based on the same information. So that was just a comment. If we go back to manifold learning, now we have descriptors and the metrics. We can just plug it in to the kernel and do everything the same. Compute the kernel between the measurements now of the new metric, normalize the kernel, apply eigenvalue decomposition, get the eigenvectors, and those eigenvectors represent the underlying processes that we know. So let me show you some results. First, for the molecular dynamics case, the idea is to track the molecule in water from partial observations. We divided the atoms into two groups, or two sets, odd atoms and even atoms. What we see here, I hope that you can see it, this is actually two-dimensional trajectories that represent the trajectories of the dihedral angles of the molecule. This is the ground truth. The color scheme is according to the values of the principal eigenvector that we get from the manifold learning approach. It means that this is our representation. Now, as you can see, the color scheme that we get based on the odd atoms and the color scheme that we get based on the even atoms is the same. We which means that the representation that we got is indeed intrinsic. It doesn't matter if we observe the odd atoms or the even atoms, we got the same representation. Another thing is that the gradient of the color is parallel to the x-axis, which means that this particular eigenvector reveals one of the dihedral atoms. Now, if we compare it to another manifold learning technique like diffusion map, then you can see here that, first of all, the color schemes are different, which means that the representation depends on the way that we measure things, and also we don't get such a nice gradient. I'm not getting into details, but based on that intrinsic representation, we learned the model on the representation to the atoms, and we're able to reconstruct the entire molecule. So what you can see here is just 3 snapshots from the trajectory of the motion of the entire molecule. What we have here is the ground truth, the entire molecule, and the reconstructed one. And as you can see, this is quite different. The second application, predicting epileptic seizures. So what I show here is the representation of 2 intervals of measurement. One interval that comes right before seizure, and one interval that is from an hour before the seizure. Here in the scatter plot, each point represents a frame. What the axis of the scatter plot is the 3 principal eigenvectors that we got from the manifold learning. This is the representation that we give. And the color indicates the interval. So the blue points are from our samples from the interval that is far from the seizure, and the red points are frames that are just before the seizure, and as you can see, we get quite a nice distinction.